Did you know that only 6% of sexual assault cases result in a conviction? How do we stop survivors of sexual violence from being re-traumatized by the criminal justice system? We're going to talk about restorative and transformative justice. What are the alternatives to the criminal justice system? Let's get in focus with Pam Hrick, who's the Executive Director and General Counsel for LEAF, Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. Hi, Pam.
Hi, Lee.
So we've got a heavy topic today, which is really about rights for women, making sure that there's more equality and transformative justice, right, on different levels and scopes. One of the questions that I wanted us to jump into is, we know that sexual violence, survivors of sexual violence often get re-traumatized when they go through the criminal justice system. LEAF just issued a report about that. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, and exactly to your point, when people experience, and disproportionately it's women experience sexual violence, the common default response seems to be, as a society, go to the criminal legal system. That's the route. And when they go there, they find that actually they have very little control over the response. They have little control over the process, and they end up in a situation where they have to tell people in the system over and over again what has happened to them and the very deeply traumatizing ways that they have experienced what has happened to them. And in some cases, if they go to trial, for example, being cross-examined by defense counsel, really having their integrity questioned, their recollection questioned, the ways in which the criminal system treats survivors isn't really conducive to healing for many, many survivors. So what LEAF wanted to do in that context is look at other ways, other options that can be presented to survivors of sexual violence to help them deal with the experience that they've had and seek justice and healing that works for them. So restorative justice and transformative justice are a couple of different options out there, and they have long histories generally rooted in Black, Indigenous, racialized, queer, trans sex worker communities that really center that healing. And we commissioned two experts, Tamara Burnett and Mandy Gray, to do some consulting across the country and speak to people who are engaged in these systems, and speak to lawyers as well, and find out what are the barriers to accessing restorative and transformative justice. By that, we mean really healing-centered, collaborative, in some cases, approaches to letting somebody say, this is how I've been harmed, this is how you harmed me, how to help ensure that person takes accountability for the harm that they've done, hopefully learn from and repair some of that harm, and ensure it doesn't happen in the future. Right. And that's what we wanted to really look at.
Okay. Well, I mean, in terms of some of the findings, like, it's presenting also alternative options, right?
Yeah, exactly.
What does that look like?
I think what it looks like is ensuring that there is access to information about these alternatives, that people who would be approached when somebody experiences sexual violence, so I think that's everyone from lawyers to support workers to healthcare workers, are equipped with information about different ways that a survivor can choose to proceed when they've experienced sexual violence. That's one piece of it. So education. The other piece is actually having access to those processes. So by that, I mean ensuring that governments in particular are funding practitioners, are funding and investing in developing those options so that they are viable ones that survivors can turn to. So funding and education were big pieces of recommendations that were coming out of our report.
Okay. So funding coming from the federal government, provincial government?
Both. Yeah. I think both governments have a role to play. And we've started having conversations with federal decision makers and reaching out to provincial elected officials here in Ontario, at least, to have conversations about that.
Okay. So, I mean, we've talked about that, like, overall in the criminal justice system. There was also a section in the report that was about reporting campus sexual assault violence. And finding solutions, because a lot of people don't make reports after going through such a traumatic experience. Yeah. What are some of those solutions?
So I think, just to touch on the piece of, a lot of people choose to simply, I think some people would put it this way, to just move on with their lives. Yeah. They don't want to confront it, and they don't want to go through any system that's going to end up treating them the way we described off the top. So that's sort of part of the imperative of having alternatives. In the campus situation in particular, we know that I think it's 1 in 4 experiences of sexual violence in the lifetime of a survivor will occur on university campuses, and there are hot periods. 4. I think it's something like that. And there are hot periods over the course of the academic year, being really during the welcome week, or when I was younger, which is quite some time ago now, Frosh Week, where there's a lot of alcohol-facilitated sexual assault. And there's really a need to have preventative conversations with young people that don't just start at the university age, but start much, much younger and start from basic concepts of the right to be able to say, I don't want my body touched.
Well, it's like no means no, right? It's a campaign, an education campaign that women have the right, or people have the right to determine, okay, stop.
Yeah. And even beyond that, only yes means yes. So there's no presumption of I'll go forward and I have your consent until you say no. The state of the law in Canada is it's only when I say yes that you have my consent to do anything. So I think education in that context as well, and in the campus context, is really important too. And having supports in university communities to be able to help survivors especially, but also provide supports to perpetrators as well to ensure better accountability. And again, that prevention piece moving forward.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in terms, I just think about even following things that are happening at TMU, that there were assaults that were happening in the washroom, and they were like, hey, you need to beef up security, and it doesn't feel safe for students to go to it. And so I think this is an important conversation to have about education. It's about having supports by the university, the college, the school, to ensure that. And it's what can people do when they experience that? People want to just put it behind them and forget it. But is there justice in that? What are other forms of justice?
Exactly. And for some survivors, that would be the piece that they want to explore. Some survivors, what'll be right for them is to move forward. But the important part is for us, I think, as a society, to have that and call it kind of a menu of options for survivors to say, this is what's right for me, and to be informed about what those different choices are before they're sort of put in a position of having to make them.
Yeah, no, and I think that's really important. So let's talk a little bit about LEAF.
Yeah.
Tell me about what LEAF's mandate is.
Yeah, so LEAF is an organization that's been around since 1985. So we're coming up on 40 years. It has a mandate to advance the equality rights of women, girls, trans, and non-binary people. And we do that using litigation, law reform, and public legal education to advance change. Yeah. Over the course of almost 40 years, LEAF has been integral in creating change, progressive change, protecting the rights traditionally of women. And it was only last year that we updated our mandate to be fully inclusive of all trans folks and non-binary folks as well. But every sexual assault case that has gone up to the Supreme Court, every law that's been enacted at the federal level having to do with sexual assault, beyond that, family law issues, pension law issues. The areas of law that touch on gender equality are so vast. LEAF has been there and has had its fingerprints on the development of all of those areas and those rights over the course of almost 40 years.
So and I think that's really important, because we know that having advocacy makes a big difference, right? And for something that is trying to advocate for women, there's a gender disparity, right? In terms of advocating for those rights. And one of the things I think in your current report about restorative justice and transformative justice is that it doesn't always have to be legal solutions.
Yeah.
So what are some of those non-legal solutions, removing some of those non-legal barriers?
Yeah, this is one of the really interesting pieces of our work. And we talk about this sometimes, really the limits of the law to achieve equality. There's really a need for education, culture change, social change that isn't going to be done within the four walls of a courtroom. So having having those pieces outside of the legal processes are really important. And the other piece of that as well is that we're talking not just about a legal system and laws, we're talking about colonial legal systems and laws. So part of one of our priorities at LEAF over the course of our 5-year current strategic plan is really amplifying the voices of Indigenous communities and working to support the revitalization of Indigenous legal traditions as well. So those are other things that should be built up and really fostered as options for justice outside of colonial systems.
Do you have an example of that?
Restorative justice, coming back to the theme of the conversation, restorative justice has deep roots in Indigenous communities. And one example of that is healing circles. And these sorts of things can be implemented entirely outside of formal criminal legal structures or complementary to them. So there are some examples of healing circles being used as a sentencing tool in combination sort of with the criminal legal system. And those are really infused with the traditions of specific Indigenous communities and really respect for what the healing processes and learnings and teachings of those communities and cultures are. So creating space for those sorts of traditions to be respected and elevated and understood as what they are, which is very viable and really viable systems that ought to exist and be empowered to exist on their own.
Yeah, that's like pretty intense, like in terms of like taking colonial, like our system is entirely structured on colonial structures, and to shift that, like a whole, like judicial system is based on that. So I think that must be a lot of heavy work. Yeah,
there's a lot of heavy work that we do at LEAF because there's a lot of gender inequality in Canada and beyond, and so it's really it brings home to me so often the importance of the work that we do and the impact that we can have in trying to reduce some of the inequities and barriers that women and gender diverse folks experience often just moving through the world.
I mean, what are other initiatives that you're currently focused on to address some of the things?
We have a reproductive justice project that we've been working on over the last year, almost year and a half now. And I'll start by explaining what I mean by reproductive justice. I think a lot of people will be familiar with the discourse that we've been hearing about access to abortion and abortion rights, really stemming from what's happening in the United States and serious attacks on the rights of women and all people who are pregnant to decide whether or not to continue with that pregnancy. What reproductive justice means is something that includes that, but goes beyond it and really talks about the ways in which we can empower people to make decisions on when, whether, and how to have children. And then once they do have children, to be able to have the ability to raise them with dignity and the supports that they need to, again, simply move through the world and raise those children. So that's everything from access to contraception, access to childcare once someone does have children, being able to support folks in making those choices for themselves.
Those seems like very common things that we're all struggling with. Like, I mean, in Toronto, like childcare, affordable childcare is a big thing. I mean, fortunately, there are, there's more spaces now, and the government is trying to reduce it to $10 a day. But I think from this particular lens of justice and having a child, there's more complexity to it.
Yeah, there is more complexity to it, and it's a really sort of broad range of things that we have to tackle when you think about the concept like that. When you think about the concept of reproductive justice, to sort of put it in the contemporary context, like an ongoing issue is universal access to contraception. Yeah. And this is something we're seeing play out in provinces slowly across the country. Earlier this year, British Columbia, their provincial government, announced that they would fund access to universal contraception. So that's everything from IUDs to birth control to Plan B. And we've seen that just a couple of weeks ago announced by the Manitoba government. Okay. They're going to do that as well. last week.
So this wasn't common already. This is still a fight that is very real.
Exactly. And a very discrete issue that would seem like it's a no-brainer from a sort of a feminist lens and a women's rights lens and a gender equality lens, but it's also a no-brainer from a financial lens as well. Because when you think of the implications of having someone be forced to deal with an unintended pregnancy because perhaps they don't have the financial resources to access those means of contraception on their own. Those are much greater costs, like dollar for dollar costs, than investing in universal contraception. So we just saw last week in Ontario, there was a motion in the legislature to support including your universal access to contraception in the OHIP program. And that was voted down by progressive conservative MPPs. But there is still a lot of advocacy that we're also very supportive of that are being led by a number of different groups to ensure that there is that universal access.
It's so funny because I think about when I was growing up, and in university, I feel like there are all these campaigns, no means no. And in the university, there was always access to contraceptives and, but I guess it's still a fight that continues, and you take that for granted, that we haven't overcome all of those milestones. And the fact that it just got voted down in the provincial, parliament is a big deal.
Yeah, it's really a lot of what's been happening over the last couple of years, I think, has been a real reminder for me specifically as a woman and as a lesbian that the rights that we have gained for women and for the broader 2S LGBTQ plus community, they're not guaranteed. Progress is not guaranteed to be linear.
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly not going fast enough, but that we will maintain it in any given time is not a given either. See what's happening in the US.
Yeah.
We see what's happening there in respect of trans rights and attacks on trans folks. And we're seeing it here in Canada as well. So it is really this is a very heavy conversation we're having, but it's really a necessary one. We can't be complacent and we can't assume that the things that we have won will be guaranteed for all time.
And that's really hard. I mean, I think things that as we're talking about this, even leading up to this conversation, I was like, what? How is this an issue still? I thought we overcame this. And I think when we talk about what happened in the States about overturning Roe versus Wade, people are like, wait a minute, in the 60s, I thought we overcame this. Now I'm 90 and I have to go fight this again. Yep. So what do we do? What are some takeaways? What's some call to actions?
Well, some calls to action are really, it's at a general level for people to the extent they have time, because again, we're talking about populations that are so overburdened with work and childcare, trying their best to inform oneself of these sorts of issues. So we try to make that as easy as possible at LEAF. So I would encourage folks who are listening and interested to follow our Twitter account and our Instagram account, and we're at LEAF National on those platforms. We really try to break things down in bite-sized pieces, what can be really complicated legal concepts, so that people who are pressed for time and people who don't have legal training can understand what's going on. I'd also encourage folks, feel free to visit our website at leaf.ca, and you can sign up for a quarterly newsletter that again takes that approach of sort of breaking down issues in a really accessible way for folks. And when you have an opportunity to, and you feel empowered to, speaking up for the rights of not just ourselves, but those among us who are more marginalized and who could use those voices of allyship in really fighting for their rights.
I mean, I think, I'm just trying to think about the everyday person trying to get by, on a day-to-day basis with life and the busyness and housing and childcare, healthcare, right? How do people stay on top of these issues, right? Because they're like, oh, someone else is going to fight that. And I have to say, when you talk about legal systems, it can often feel like there's a wall where it's so far removed, that's not my world. What can I do? I'm not a lawyer, because you think about legal systems being something that only lawyers can access, right? And so how do people start standing up for things, or how do people start initiating, we need to protect this, or we need to do something about this?
Yeah, it's hard. People have so much going on in their lives, and it's really the people that we're as an organization trying to fight for systemic change for. So disproportionately, there are lots of folks who don't have the bandwidth, and quite reasonably so, to do anything beyond, I'm going to get myself out the door to work if I'm fortunate enough to have a job. I'm going to pay the bills, struggle to pay the bills. And I don't have the time to really engage in things beyond the immediate, pressing, understandable basic needs. So for those, this is why I think it's even more important in that context that those of us who do happen to have those resources are able to sort of spend some of our time engaging in that advocacy, that we're able to, where we can, put our money in form of donations into organizations that are doing this work. And that's how we can sort of help have an impact and mitigate or make up for the reality that our some of our fellow citizens and fellow folks who live around us just don't have access to that time and those resources to do it.
So I'm kind of curious, how do people help inform what LEAF's mandate is? Or how do you kind of get a sense of, this is a big issue, we need to start focusing on it, right? How does that come up to percolate up?
Yeah, well, we have with our organization a broad base of membership. We have almost a dozen volunteer branches locally across the country. So from Edmonton and Calgary to the west, Thunder Bay, Hamilton, Windsor, and others here in Ontario, and all the way out to Halifax in the east. So we are fortunate through that kind of network to get a sense of issues that are coming up on the ground and impacting people. And we also have a pretty wide range of organizations and individuals that we work with as well that bring issues to our desk. So a lot of the work that we do, or a good chunk of the work that we do, is kind of driven by grant funding at this point. So when I talk about the Reproductive Justice Project, we are doing that through a grant that's funded by the federal government. And when we are coming to developing that grant, we're thinking about what are the pressing issues? What are the issues that we're seeing in the landscape that are really impacting women and gender diverse people? And how can we put together a project that is going to be responsive to the challenges that they're experiencing? And that's really how this project, and many organizations like ours, projects like those, come to light, is understanding and taking a look at the landscape and seeing where our skill set and our resources can be best put to use to help improve the lives of those that we're advocating for.
Yeah, no, and I think that's super duper important. I mean, I just feel legally, a lot of people just feel I'm not in the field, there's nothing I can do about it. And yet it's so important because it is the framework for which other things can, alternatives for resolution and that sort of thing.
Yeah. It's really interesting being a systems change organization as well. So we don't do frontline services. Yeah. There are places that do that client service, direct advice to folks. There are organizations that provide sort of counseling for women and gender diverse folks who are trying to leave situations of violence. And what we really try to do is sort of layer on top. We're layered on top of that effectively. Yeah. We're trying to change the rules of the game, really, and the resources that they have access to provide better support to the folks who are coming to frontline service providers and ensure that their rights are better respected and that they have more substantial rights as well. So some of the conversations that I have from time to time are really about that and trying to translate for people. We don't come and say we've served 100 women and gender diverse folks this past month. We go and say, well, we were involved in law reform to give survivors the choice of whether to have a publication ban on their own names in a sexual assault prosecution, which has not been something that, in effect, survivors have had the right to. Mm-hmm. So we change it at that level, and then the people who are providing support one-to-one can say, all right, the system is now different. Right. You can choose yes or no, both choices being valid, but we're going to help you get through this system in a way that's more conducive to you feeling like you have agency.
Right. So like this report that just came out, right? Transformative justice and restorative justice. What's the next step for it now that you have this report?
Yeah, we've been having some good meetings with federal MPs, and we've started a bit of outreach at the provincial level here in Ontario. We're going to really be focusing on taking those, I think, the 7 recommendations from the report and advocating to decision makers to implement them. Okay. The one that is probably the most sort of discrete, that'd be a good example to talk about, is in some provinces, including Ontario, there is a moratorium in offering restorative justice to survivors of sexual violence when a criminal prosecution has been started. Uh-huh. So take the example, a sexual assault charge has been laid. There's an option in other places in the system for other charges to divert that from the criminal system and to use restorative justice to do it. There's a ban on doing that for sexual assault. And that ban was put in place. It was called a moratorium because it was meant to be basically a stopgap. We're going to say no for now while we build up the capacity to be able to offer restorative justice for sexual violence. And that was back in the 90s. And here we are, 25 years later, and there's still that moratorium. So one of the recommendations that we have coming out of the report is to revisit and ultimately end those moratoriums in the provinces where they exist so that survivors can have the choice to say, restorative justice it sounds like something that would be better for me and better center my healing.
Right.
And to not have the system itself be a barrier, the criminal system itself to be a barrier from accessing that. And we've heard from survivors specifically who want that choice and who have spoken openly about how frustrating it is for Crowns to be saying to them, listen, I can't do that. Like it's a rule, it's over here.
Right.
We can't do that, even when it's what the survivor wants. So that's one thing that we're going to be engaging at the provincial level to try to encourage change on.
Okay. So that's one of the ones that you said were more discreet. What are the other 6? Like, what's your tops?
I think that's a top, and one that I think is a very achievable goal
25 years later.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we're at the point in seeing there's enough interest in it, and we're having enough calls from survivors themselves to say this is something we'd find helpful to have as an option. So I'm really hopeful to have some good conversations with folks, and in collaboration across, there are many organizations that are calling for this and supportive of this as well. So I don't want to make it seem like LEAF is out here sort of leading a charge on our own. I'm hopeful we're going to have some good conversations and advocacy in the next year on that. Public education, a big one as well, because I think there's a lack of knowledge among just the general public as well as legal practitioners about what reproductive justice is and what what restorative justice is and what transformative justice is. And some folks would say, I had no idea that thing existed over there. And I would have been interested if I had known. So that public education piece is a big one, and is a recommendation coming out of our report. The funding piece to ensure that there are practitioners who are able to provide these services and facilitate restorative and transformative justice, because it doesn't really do much good if we have a situation, for example, where moratoriums are lifted, or we start saying there's this great thing called restorative justice, and we have nobody who's able to do it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So investing in those programs is a really big issue as well.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of systems change, it does require, like, for once you initiate one change, there's a catalyst, right? You unlock all these other pieces.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the things that we also talked about, and I know, like, you were the former chair of the 519 board. And so trans rights, non-binary rights are something that's really important. It's also something that LEAF has had a focus on.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I was about to say I'm happy to, but I am dismayed that I have to.
Yeah.
Also, we've been seeing such a wave of transphobia and violence and hate that has spread both across across the U.S. and we've seen it infiltrate up here in Canada. And I don't want to say that we've had a great we haven't had a great history in terms of securing trans rights. And we have a tendency, I think, as a country to sort of look at ourselves comparatively to the US, and we can say it's way worse down there.
Right. Yep.
We've really seen in the last year how bad it's getting here in Canada as well. So we're seeing a lot of rhetoric, a lot of talk in the public sphere, treating trans folks as if they are threats, and specifically threats to women's safety, which as a woman, I just wholeheartedly reject. It's just not right. And we're seeing governments really start to endorse these sentiments through policies. I'll point specifically to New Brunswick and Saskatchewan. And those two provinces have adopted policies, and Saskatchewan has now done it through legislation that says for kids under 16, so trans and non-binary youth under 16, you don't have the right to have your gender identity respected at school unless your parents say it's okay. And by the way, if you come to us and say, I'm actually, my gender identity is something other than what I was assigned at birth, and I want to be called a name that reflects that gender identity, in Saskatchewan, the government's legislation says, okay, we're going to go tell your parents about it. And if they say no, then we're not going to respect it. And there's two elements of that are really dangerous. One is a forced outing, even if kids aren't feeling safe.
Right.
And then there's also the requirement to misgender these folks. And there's lots of research on how harmful it is and how degrading it is for somebody to be deliberately misgendered, especially over and over and in front of peers. It actually it harms trans and gender diverse youth in ways that exacerbate the sort of existing feelings that many experience of feeling othered, of not belonging, of being subject to increased risk of harassment and threats and physical harm. So it's this environment we're contributing to, or we see governments contributing to this environment where we're really normalizing it being okay to treat trans folks as others and people who don't deserve rights. And it's incredibly alarming.
So how is LEAF hoping to address this?
Yeah, we've been doing a number of things over the last couple of years. And as I mentioned earlier, we updated our mandate as an organization just at the beginning of 2022 to be fully trans inclusive and inclusive non-binary folks. So as an organization, we've been on a learning journey as well. And I've been trying to stand shoulder to shoulder with trans folks and trans-led organizations and the advocacy that we've done. So that's involved in a couple of the Atlantic provinces as well as Ontario, advocacy for gender affirming healthcare. It has involved in the legal sphere, intervening in the legal challenges to the Saskatchewan legislation that I just described, and the New Brunswick policy, which is very similar to what I just described as well. So trying to use our stature and our expertise as a legal organization to advocate for trans folks and non-binary folks as well. But those relationships that we've been fortunate to build and the knowledge that we've been acquiring over the last little while, I think has allowed us better to stand in solidarity with trans non-binary folks.
No, I mean, I think that's so, that perspective is really, really helpful. And there's just so much work that needs to be done. And being a system change organization, it's almost like people may not even be aware that there are groups out there to help. So I really appreciate you sharing the information of how people can get involved, make donations, like follow your reports and stuff. So, I mean, even yourself, like, okay, so let's talk about you. Like, I mean, as a lawyer, right? Like, I mean, I know you started off, working for the Attorney General as a ledge assistant. Your path down this road, like, one of the things that I always have people ask is like, how'd you get into this role? Right? Like, and what led you down? Did you think that you were going to become, the executive director of an organization that's supposed to lead systems change? What was sort of like your process?
Okay, so my journey on this specific question, I kind of tracked back to my university days at the University of Ottawa, and I was involved in a campaign called Take Back the Campus, which was a play on Take Back the Night, which is an annual event recognizing the extent of gender-based violence and honoring the lives of those who have been lost to gender-based violence. But we were experiencing a significant level, what we thought was a significant level of harassment and sexual assault on campus that wasn't being dealt with adequately. Yeah. And that seems like a story that has predated me, postdates my time at university, an evergreen problem, unfortunately. But that was really my first foray into feminist advocacy. So I go back to that and thinking of the ways in which that I have sort of come to identify myself as an advocate for women's rights, an advocate against sexual violence and gender-based violence more broadly. So throughout my career, since undergrad, as I went to law school, I got involved in the Sexual Assault Center on the board in Kingston. In my practice, when I was litigating, I did some work advocating for survivors of sexual violence and representing organizations in legal cases that raised their rights. And I was doing that all at a time when the big piece of my practice, I was starting to be encouraged to think about doing more corporate commercial litigation in a generalist firm. And I had, really many wonderful experiences in practice. But as those conversations were starting to happen at the end of 2020, we're sort of in the midst of the early stages of the pandemic. I'm starting to think am I using the skills that I have to do the things that I most want to do and things that I feel most passionate about? And that's when this job came up at Leaf. A couple people sent it to me. I thought, this looks amazing. For somebody who's probably got 10 years more experience than I do. But I threw my hat in the ring anyway and ended up landing the job. That's how I came here. So when I recount the story, I often leave with the moral of don't count yourself out from opportunities.
Well, I'm I always like to wrap up, an interview with like a favorite quote. And so I'm going to read the quote that you had shared with me, which is, of course, a favorite from Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Whatever you choose to do, leave tracks. And that means don't do just for yourself, because in the end, it's not going to be fully satisfying. You will want to leave the world a little better for your having lived. Tell me about why this is a favorite quote.
Yeah. And I usually shorthand it as, whatever you do, leave tracks. So I was happy to look it up and get the full quote for you earlier. To that, it means don't just do things in a way maybe that maintains the status quo and that won't leave any impression if someone's looking at the trajectory of your life and what you've done over the last, looking back 15, 20, eventually, hopefully 50 years. And say it was nice that they moved through the world and we have no impact to speak of.
Absolutely.
So my hope in this and the other things that I've done is that in some small way, more often than not, I can help to make a difference that might lead somebody to look back on, hopefully me, to be able to look back on my life and say, I did a thing that mattered.
Well, definitely. I mean, the work that you're doing at Leaf is really important and transformative. So thank you so much, Pam. I really appreciate you coming.
Thanks, Lee. It's great to chat with you.
Thanks for checking out this episode. You want to make sure to like, subscribe, and share so that you don't miss out on the next In Focus episode on topics that matter to you.